Hello, and welcome to the Silent Empires. If you're new here, please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. You can also support us by sending a super thanks on this video. Your support truly helps the channel grow. Now relax and enjoy the story.
When federal prosecutors in New York finally brought Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano into a modern courtroom, they were not just charging a single man. In their view, they were putting decades of quiet influence and hidden power on trial. Here was a stocky, aging figure from Queens, known in FBI files as a captain in the Gambino crime family, a man whose name had circulated for years in wiretaps, informant reports, and whispered conversations in neighborhood bars. On one side of the aisle sat agents and attorneys who had built their careers trying to dismantle the American mafia. On the other sat relatives, friends, and supporters who still saw him as a family man, a neighborhood presence, someone who had paid bar tabs and sent envelopes at Christmas. Between those two perspectives lay the fault line of an era. The long shadow of prohibition, the rise of organized crime, and the stubborn charisma of men who built reputations on fear, loyalty, and silence. To understand how Anthony Ruggiano arrived at that moment, how a boy from a Brooklyn tenement became, in the eyes of the government, a symbol of the mafia's grip on New York, we have to go back to the beginning, to a city and a childhood shaped by poverty, prejudice, and the lure of the street. Anthony Ruggiano was born in 1921 in Brooklyn, New York, into a working-class Italian-American family at a time when the city was exploding with new arrivals from southern Italy and Sicily. His parents, like so many of their neighbors, lived in cramped railroad apartments in dense neighborhoods where several families might share a bathroom down the hall, and laundry lines crisscrossed the narrow courtyards. The surname, Ruggiano itself, carried with it the mark of the Mezzogiorno, the impoverished south of Italy that had supplied New York with hundreds of thousands of migrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For many of those families, the Lower East Side and parts of Brooklyn were only a half step up from the villages they had left behind. Wages were low, hours were long, and prejudice against Italians was open and unembarrassed. The New York of his childhood was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand were the granite banks and skyscrapers of Manhattan's financial district. On the other, the unpaved side streets and pushcart markets of neighborhoods like East New York and Brownsville, where small children dodged horses and streetcars and older boys hustled for coins. The Ruggiano household existed in this second world. Italian was still spoken in kitchens and on stoops, and the Catholic Church anchored community life with its rituals and festivals. Yet the authority of priests and parents competed with another kind of influence that was steadily gaining strength in the streets, the informal power of local toughs, extortionists, and organizers who would eventually be called the Mafia. The timing of his birth mattered. Prohibition had gone into effect the year before, in 1920, banning the sale of alcoholic drinks and unintentionally opening a vast new market for illegal enterprise. Across New York, a parallel economy sprang up almost overnight. In basement speakeasies and backroom bars, liquor flowed. Bootleggers, smugglers, and enforcers collected profits that dwarfed what any factory job could provide. Children growing up in these neighborhoods saw, with their own eyes, which men in the community wore tailored suits, drove cars, and handed out dollar bills on holidays, and which men trudged to work and back with dinner pails and worn shoes. It would have been impossible for a boy like Anthony not to notice that distinction, even if, as a child, he did not yet fully understand its source. Italian immigrants had arrived in an American society that frequently treated them as outsiders. Newspaper cartoons of the era mocked their accents and depicted them as inherently criminal or backward. Signs in some businesses bluntly announced, "No Italians need apply." Police attention in immigrant districts could be arbitrary and rough, and in turn, many residents learned early to be wary of uniformed authority. In that vacuum of trust, local big men emerged, figures who mediated disputes, arranged jobs, and enforced their own brand of order. By the time Anthony was born, such networks in New York's Italian communities were already beginning to coalesce into a more disciplined, more secretive structure, influenced by traditions carried over from Sicily and southern Italy. Historically, this period saw the transition from loose street gangs to something more organized. In the 1910 seconds and 1920 seconds, a wave of black-hand extortionists had terrorized Italian shopkeepers, sending threatening letters and sometimes making good on those threats. Out of that violent, fluid environment, more sophisticated criminal syndicates emerged. They invested in speakeasies, controlled bootlegging routes, and made alliances across ethnic lines. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago received most of the national headlines, but New York's underworld was just as active, if often more discreet. The city's Italian underworld would eventually be organized into the so-called five families, each with its own territory and hierarchy. One of those families would, after several changes at the top, come to be known as the Gambino crime family, the organization that Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano would later serve for decades. As he spent his earliest years in Brooklyn, however, none of those labels yet existed in newspaper shorthand. For a child, the realities of crime and corruption were woven into daily life in subtler ways. Numbers runners, taking bets on illegal lottery games, moved quietly between apartments. Men lingered outside social clubs and candy stores, keeping an eye on the street. Policemen occasionally looked the other way. Such scenes were not unique to the Ruggiano bloc. They were part of a broader national pattern in which working-class communities developed their own unwritten codes and alliances, some legal, some decidedly not. In that world, reputation meant everything, and strength, real or perceived, could be the difference between being victimized and being left alone. Then, when Anthony was just 8 years old, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression that followed reshaped his formative years. Unemployment in New York skyrocketed, especially in immigrant neighborhoods dependent on unstable, low-skilled work. Men who had been barely getting by lost what little security they had. Bread lines snaked around churches and settlement houses. Families doubled up in apartments. Children scavenged for coal along railroad tracks and did what they could to contribute to the household budget. In some homes, older siblings dropped out of school to seek whatever work they might find peddling newspapers, shining shoes, or hauling crates on the docks. This grinding deprivation did more than just strain family finances. It also altered the moral calculus of survival. In an environment where legitimate wages were scarce and landlords still demanded rent, the temptation to cut corners, to skirt the law, intensified. For some, that meant selling untaxed cigarettes or bootleg liquor. For others, running errands for men involved in more serious crimes. Sociologists who later studied these neighborhoods have argued that the lines between respectable and criminal work blurred for many families. What mattered was putting food on the table. For boys like Anthony, the street itself became both classroom and employer. The official record from his boyhood is sparse. There are no detailed autobiographies or school records prominently cited in public sources. What can be said with confidence is that he grew up in precisely the kind of environment that produced many of New York's future mob figures, an Italian enclave marked by economic stress, tight-knit family structures, and the visible presence of local gangsters who operated both as predators and, in some twisted sense, as providers. Later in life, law enforcement would note just how deeply embedded he was in the Gambino organization, an embeddedness that almost certainly had its roots in relationships and habits formed during these early years. By the early 1930 seconds, the broader underworld around him was undergoing its own transformation. Violent turf wars between competing Italian and Jewish gangs culminated in a series of bloody confrontations. The most decisive of these power struggles involved a young, ambitious gangster named Charles "Lucky" Luciano and his allies, who moved against the old guard bosses and reshaped the structure of organized crime in America. Out of this conflict came the Commission, a kind of informal board of directors that divided New York's Italian-American underworld into 5 main families and sought to regulate disputes to avoid open warfare. The boss of one of those families, Vincent Mangano, controlled rackets along the Brooklyn waterfront. Over the decades that followed, Mangano's organization would, through leadership changes and internal coups, evolve into the Gambino family. To a working-class teenager in Brooklyn, these high-level reorganizations were invisible abstractions. What he would have seen were the local effects, certain neighborhood figures becoming more established, certain clubs more heavily trafficked, certain men suddenly regarded with a new, cautious respect. Social clubs, ostensibly places for cards, bocce, and coffee, doubled as command posts. Young men who proved their reliability, who could keep their mouths shut and follow instructions, were sometimes given small tasks, watching a corner, relaying a message, collecting a minor debt. Law enforcement and later anonymous intelligence reports would often describe the process by which boys from these neighborhoods were slowly drawn into increasingly serious roles. For obvious reasons, the participants themselves left little written trace of these early informal apprenticeships, and specific details of Anthony's own first steps into illegality are thin in the public domain. There are, however, some indirect clues. By the time federal and state agencies began to systematically document the internal hierarchies of the Gambino family in the mid-20th century, Ruggiano appears not as a newcomer but as a trusted figure. This status suggests years, if not decades, of prior involvement. In the highly suspicious, insular culture of traditional Cosa Nostra, authority was earned gradually. Men who rose to leadership did so only after having proved their loyalty and usefulness over a long period. The culture that shaped him prized qualities that mainstream society might recognize in very different contexts: discretion, patience, and the ability to project calm under stress. In neighborhoods where talking to the police, ratting, was considered one of the worst possible betrayals, children could grow up with a deeply ingrained suspicion of government institutions. Disputes were to be handled in the family, whether that meant within the actual household or within the wider social circle forged in clubs and cafes. At the same time, a code of generosity coexisted with the ever-present threat of coercion. Men involved in rackets might pay for a funeral, help a widow with rent, or arrange a job for a neighbor's son. Such gestures made them seem indispensable to many in the community, even as their activities contributed to the very insecurity that kept people dependent on them. It is within this tangle of fear, respect, and dependence that Anthony's adolescent years unfolded. Accounts from those who later studied the Gambino family note that Brooklyn and Queens in the 1932nd were dotted with hangouts where future mob figures first learned how the world of organized crime operated. Some took jobs in legitimate businesses owned or influenced by wise guys: trucking companies, construction firms, bars, and restaurants. Others earned a reputation as reliable earners in illegal markets like gambling and loan sharking. While the documents do not list every job young Ruggiano held, his eventual prominence indicates that he navigated this ecosystem successfully, finding a role that placed him near the center rather than at the margins. The end of Prohibition in 1933 changed, but did not end, the opportunity structure around him. Speakeasies either went legitimate or closed, but organized crime quickly diversified. Illegal gambling expanded. Bookmaking on horse racing and sports flourished. The numbers racket, a precursor to the modern lottery, became a daily habit for tens of thousands of working-class New Yorkers. High-interest loans to desperate borrowers, loan sharking, provided another major revenue stream. Protection rackets targeted businesses. Control of labor unions, particularly on the docks and in the trucking industry, allowed mobsters to skim from paychecks and manipulate contracts. All of these activities required layers of trusted intermediaries and local enforcers. As the nation moved toward World War II, young men of Anthony's generation faced conscription, factory work, or some combination of both. Some future mobsters served honorably in the armed forces and returned to the neighborhoods with new skills and contacts. Others managed, through legal deferments or less official means, to avoid military service. The public record does not clearly document what role, if any, the war played in Ruggiano's life. What is clear is that, by the late 1942, when the United States was entering its post-war boom, the Brooklyn and Queens underworlds in which he moved were thriving. Wartime shortages and black markets had created still more ways to make money off the books, and the wealth accumulated by organized crime during those years helped finance its expansion into new ventures in the decades to come. In the post-war period, Italian-American families began to move, in significant numbers, from the dense tenements of older neighborhoods into somewhat more spacious sections of Queens and Brooklyn, chasing the dream of a better life with a front stoop or a small yard. For men tied to the underworld, this move often meant establishing operations in new areas while maintaining ties to the old neighborhoods. Ozone Park, Howard Beach, and surrounding communities in Queens would become well known in later FBI files as strongholds of Gambino influence. It was in this evolving urban landscape that Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano came fully into his own, as an adult, a man balancing, as so many mob figures did, the outward appearance of a traditional family provider with a deepening, carefully hidden involvement in organized crime. Even that outward respectability had a context. In mid-century America, the ideal of the breadwinning husband and the domestic wife was powerful, especially in Catholic, working-class communities. Marriage, children, and stable housing were markers of success. Men who had grown up amidst the scarcity of the Depression often equated material comfort, a nicer suit, a newer car, a larger apartment, not only with personal achievement but with dignity. Yet for those whose main income came from rackets, that comfort rested on constant vigilance. Neighbors might suspect, police might observe, rival groups might covet territory. Children in such households grew up sensing, even if they did not yet understand, that their father's world contained layers they were not meant to see. In the years following World War II, law enforcement's understanding of the mafia remained surprisingly limited. Many official voices still denied that a coherent national criminal organization even existed. This skepticism, combined with corruption in some local precincts and political offices, allowed traditional organized crime families to operate with relative confidence. Internal discipline was strict. Violations of the unwritten code could be punished harshly. Promotions within the hierarchy were relatively rare and carried significant meaning. The fact that Anthony Ruggiano would, in time, be recognized by federal authorities as a made member and later a captain in the Gambino family indicates how far he had traveled from the crowded Brooklyn apartment of his childhood and how thoroughly his life had become entwined with an institution that had grown alongside him. Decades later, when his son and former associates would testify in courtrooms about the structure and traditions of that world, their stories traced a line that ran back, inevitably, to those early years, to a boy born in 1921 into a city buffeted by prohibition, depression, and war. A boy who absorbed, as normal, the presence of men who settled scores their own way and measured right and wrong by a code separate from the law. The journey from that boyhood to the seasoned figure in the dock took many turns, each embedded in the evolving history of New York itself. In the years after World War II, the city that had shaped Anthony Ruggiano's childhood was changing, but the unwritten rules of his world were not. New York was suddenly prosperous. Veterans came home, married, started families, and looked for housing beyond the cramped tenements of old Brooklyn. Whole sections of Queens that had been fields or low-rise blocks began filling with modest 1U and 2-family homes. For upwardly mobile Italian-American families, these neighborhoods offered what seemed like a fresh start, a little more space, slightly cleaner streets, and the sense that the worst years of the Depression were finally behind them. For a man like Anthony, now in his 20s and then early 30s, that post-war migration was an opportunity. Moving into Queens did not mean leaving the underworld behind. It meant extending it into new territory. Ozone Park, Howard Beach, and other nearby neighborhoods attracted many families from the older Brooklyn enclaves, bringing with them their dialects, their parishes, and their habits. With them also came the quiet influence of the 5 families, whose leaders saw fresh possibilities in these developing areas. New bars, new construction, new businesses to tax or control. By most accounts, it was during this period that Anthony's involvement in organized crime deepened from the informal street-level hustles of youth into a more structured, enduring role. Neighbors would later recall that he carried himself with a particular kind of confidence, neither flashy nor timid. He dressed well, though not extravagantly, favored neighborhood social clubs and bars, and seemed always to have cash. Outwardly, he was a family man and a businessman, someone who could be seen at local restaurants, sometimes picking up the check, sometimes quietly pulling a friend aside for a private conversation. Inside the world of the Gambino family, however, he was becoming something more. Former associates and federal agents who pieced together his trajectory later described him as a classic product of the Mangano-Anastasia Gambino lineage, a man who had come up in the Brooklyn strongholds of the old Mangano family, then moved comfortably into the reorganized structure as bosses changed. According to later testimony by informants, including his own son decades afterward, Anthony's reliability and ability to earn money for his superiors made him a natural candidate for formal induction. Sometime in the 1952, under the reign of boss Albert Anastasia, or soon after under Carlo Gambino, he was reportedly brought into the inner circle of Cosa Nostra as a sworn member. The ceremony itself was never described by Anthony, who went to his grave without speaking publicly about his life in the mafia. But others in similar positions later told courts and juries what such an induction involved: an oath of loyalty, taken over a holy image, a pledge to place the organization above all else, and a stark warning about the consequences of betrayal. For law enforcement, the moment of being made was crucial. A made man could not be assaulted or harmed without approval from higher-ups. He was entitled to a share of certain rackets and, in turn, expected to contribute a steady stream of income and to enforce the family's interests. Once inside that circle, Anthony's life became even more tightly bound to the fortunes of the Gambino organization. His base of operations centered on Queens, especially Ozone Park, where he would eventually be identified in FBI documents as a key figure. One focal point was a neighborhood bar that, in time, came to be widely known as Fat Andy's. Officially, it was just another local tavern where residents watched sports, played cards, and drank beer. Unofficially, according to police surveillance and later court testimony, it functioned as a de facto headquarters, a place where messages were relayed, debts discussed, and decisions made away from the bright lights of Manhattan. The activities managed by men like Anthony were, in many ways, the backbone of traditional Cosa Nostra economics. Illegal gambling remained a staple. Bookmakers took bets on horse races and sporting events, operating with enough discretion to avoid drawing constant raids, but openly enough that anyone in the know could find them. The numbers racket continued to thrive among working-class New Yorkers who wagered a few cents on three-digit combinations hoping for a small windfall. Into that mix came loan sharking, high-interest, short-term lending to people and businesses cut off from conventional credit. On paper, these were loans. In practice, the pressure to repay and the penalties for failing to do so were intense. The presence of such operations had tangible effects on the community. Some business owners felt they had little choice but to take money or protection from local mob figures if they wanted to avoid harassment or damage to their property. Others willingly collaborated, drawn by the prospect of quick loans or a steady flow of customers funneled their way. As one former Queens resident later recalled to reporters, there was a sense that certain men ran the neighborhood and that it was wiser to stay on their good side. The fear might not always have been spoken aloud, but it hovered beneath the surface of daily life. Inside his home, Anthony maintained the outward image of a traditional Italian-American patriarch. He married and had children, among them a son, Anthony Jr., who would later become one of the most important witnesses to his father's hidden world. The younger Ruggiano grew up in a household where, as he later testified, money was rarely an issue, and where his father's status was an accepted fact, even if the precise nature of his work was not discussed in detail. That double life-loving parent in the kitchen, feared figure on the street was not uncommon among high-ranking mafia members, many of whom prided themselves on providing for their families even as they participated in activities that destabilized other households. The broader mafia landscape around him was shifting. In 1957, a state police raid on a gathering of mob figures in Appalachian, New York, forced the American public to confront the reality that law enforcement had long downplayed. Organized crime in the United States was not just a scattering of local thugs, but a structured national network. Among the crowd that bolted into the woods that day were bosses and high-ranking members from across the country. Although Anthony himself is not known to have been present, the repercussions of that event rippled through every level of the 5 families. Increased scrutiny meant greater caution. Meetings became more discreet, communication more compartmentalized. In the wake of Appalachian, the FBI began to devote more systematic attention to Italian-American organized crime. Special units were created, informants cultivated, and wiretaps installed on telephones linked to suspected mob hangouts. Agents compiled lists of names, building charts that mapped out who reported to whom, which crews controlled which neighborhoods, and how cash flowed upward toward the bosses. It was in these internal reports, declassified years later, that Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's name began appearing regularly, first as an associate, then as a made soldier, and eventually as a captain overseeing his own crew. Even as law enforcement intensified its efforts, the Gambino family entered what some analysts have called its golden era. After Anastasia was killed in 1957, Carlo Gambino emerged as boss, and under his reign the family became widely regarded as one of the most stable and profitable in the country. With strongholds in both Manhattan and the outer boroughs, it maintained influence over segments of the waterfront, the trucking industry, construction, and various unions. Men like Anthony, operating at the neighborhood level, were vital to that success. They were the ones who collected the street-level proceeds, settled disputes, and ensured that the family's interests were respected in their territories. One of the most consequential relationships of Anthony's life developed during this time. His connection to a younger Gambino associate from East New York named John Gotti. Gotti, born in 1940, came from a background not unlike Anthony's own, a large, working-class Italian family in a rough Brooklyn neighborhood. As Gotti's crew shifted operations into Queens, particularly Ozone Park, their paths crossed more and more. Later, law enforcement investigations and informant accounts repeatedly placed Gotti and his associates at Ruggiano's bar. Over time, the two men developed a bond grounded in mutual benefit. The older, established figure with local authority, and the ambitious younger man rising rapidly through the ranks. From the government's perspective, the convergence of these personalities in Queens made the area a priority. Surveillance teams noted patterns. The same cars parked outside the same establishments, the same faces appearing and disappearing at odd hours. But direct evidence remained hard to obtain. The mafia's code of silence, or omertà, was still largely intact in the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds. Prosecutors might suspect that Anthony and his associates were profiting from illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, but turning those suspicions into solid court cases required witnesses willing to testify and documents clearly linking him to the crimes. Meanwhile, within the Gambino family, Anthony's responsibilities grew. By the early 1960 seconds, informant reports described him as a man to whom others deferred in Queens, a conduit between street-level operatives and higher-ranking figures like underboss Aniello Della Croce. To be in that position meant walking a constant tightrope. He had to keep cash flowing up the chain of command while ensuring that those beneath him were satisfied enough not to rebel or steal. He had to resolve conflicts without attracting too much police attention, and he had to project strength without tipping into recklessness that might endanger the entire operation. The outside world was learning more about the mafia during this period too. In 1963, a mob insider named Joseph Valakai broke ranks and testified publicly before the United States Senate, describing the structure of Cosa Nostra, its codes, and some of its rituals. His revelations confirmed what many investigators had long suspected and gave them new insight into how the organization functioned. While Valakai's knowledge was centered on the Genovese family, the implications for the Gambinos were obvious. If one insider could talk, others might follow. The paranoia generated by his testimony reverberated across all 5 families, prompting renewed emphasis on secrecy and internal discipline. For Anthony, secrecy had always been second nature. By all accounts, he was not a man who sought headlines or ostentatious displays. He rarely left a paper trail. Businesses associated with him were often in the names of relatives or associates. Meetings were held in places where he could see who was coming and going. This relatively low profile helped him for many years. While some of his contemporaries drew the intense attention of tabloids and television crews, Ruggiano remained better known on the street than in the broader public eye. His reputation anchored more in whispered stories and law enforcement files than in sensational fronty-page headlines. But the human cost of the world he inhabited was real, even if it largely escaped newspaper coverage at the time. Businesses that could not keep up with loan payments closed. Families were uprooted. People who crossed the wrong line, even inadvertently, could find themselves living in fear. Decades later, when Anthony Jr. agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, he told juries that his father had been involved in multiple killings and numerous acts of intimidation, though he did not relish speaking about them. These accounts, while painful, underscored what organized crime truly meant in practice. Not a romantic underworld, but a system that maintained its profits through coercion. As the 1,960 seconds progressed, other forces began to reshape the city around him. Urban renewal projects demolished some old neighborhoods and disrupted established patterns of control. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, and cultural changes drew police and political attention toward campuses and city halls, sometimes easing the pressure temporarily on underworld figures. At the same time, a rise in drug use created new illegal markets, although the traditional mafia leadership, including many in the Gambino family, publicly discouraged involvement in narcotics out of fear of the long prison sentences such cases carried and the public outrage they provoked. Gambling, loans, and construction remained, for families like the Gambinos, safer and more predictable. In this environment, Anthony's stature solidified. By the end of the decade, federal and state authorities increasingly referred to him as a captain, a man in charge of his own crew of soldiers and associates. Captains were expected not only to generate revenue, but also to serve as political managers within the family, voting on important questions, relaying orders, and occasionally mediating conflicts between other members. For someone who had begun life in a crowded Brooklyn apartment during the Depression, it was a remarkable, if deeply troubling, ascent. He now stood at a crucial intersection between local street crime and the upper echelons of one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. At home, this rise translated into a lifestyle that, while comfortable, avoided the kind of showy extravagance that might raise too many eyebrows. The Ruggiano family had nicer clothes, better furniture, and access to cash in emergencies. Friends and acquaintances might receive quiet help with a hospital bill or funeral expense. Such acts reinforced the dual image Anthony cultivated, feared by some, appreciated by others, and regarded by many as simply part of the neighborhood's fabric, someone who had always been there, whose presence was as taken for granted as the corner deli or the parish church. Yet behind that sense of permanence, the ground was beginning to shift. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers were developing new tools designed specifically to combat organized crime. The most important of these, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, would become law in 1970. RICO allowed prosecutors to treat a criminal organization as an enterprise, linking individual acts of gambling, extortion, and fraud together as part of a broader pattern. Instead of simply charging one loan shark operation or one illegal gambling den, they could now argue that men like Anthony were part of a continuing criminal enterprise and seek much longer sentences. For the moment, though, in the late 1,960 seconds and very early 1,970 seconds, the impact of those coming legal changes had not yet fully landed in Queens. Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano was in his prime, a seasoned captain with deep roots in the neighborhood, strong ties to powerful figures within the Gambino family, and a reputation that kept both rivals and many residents wary of crossing him. His journey from the hardships of his childhood to this position of influence had followed a path well laid out by the history of his era. Migration, poverty, the emergence of the mafia, and the calculated choice to embrace the power that underworld affiliation could bring. The question, increasingly, was how long that power could last in a country that was finally beginning to understand and to seriously challenge the structures that sustained it. By the time the 1,970 seconds began, the young man who had watched Prohibition's shadows stretch across Brooklyn was gone. In his place stood a seasoned figure in middle age, deeply embedded in the Gambino family and firmly established in Queens. To the people who saw him almost daily, Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano had become one of those neighborhood constants. It was hard to imagine the streets without. To investigators quietly building files downtown, he was an important cog in a larger criminal machine they were only just beginning to understand, and more importantly, to have the tools to attack. The legal landscape around him shifted dramatically with the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in 1970. RICO, as it came to be known, allowed prosecutors to treat illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and related offenses not as isolated street crimes but as interconnected parts of an ongoing criminal enterprise. For decades, men like Anthony had survived by making sure no single case against them was too strong. Witnesses could be pressured into silence, paper trails could be kept thin, but RICO meant that if prosecutors could show a pattern of criminal activity tied to a particular organization, they could seek long prison terms against the people the FBI believed sat near the top of that structure. When the law passed, many in the underworld, including some veterans in the Five Families, did not immediately grasp how much trouble it could cause them. They had seen waves of police campaigns come and go before. Raids on gambling dens, occasional indictments for bribery or tax violations, such things were almost occupational hazards. But over the first half of the 1,970 seconds, as federal organized crime strike forces began to take shape, the government's approach changed from reactive to methodical. Instead of simply arresting bookmakers in back rooms, agents spent years charting relationships, identifying crews, and documenting how money moved up the hierarchy. In Queens, that hierarchy increasingly ran through the bars and social clubs where Anthony held court. His establishment in Ozone Park, known in law enforcement circles as Fat Andy's, regardless of its official name, was one of several neighborhood hubs where Gambino associates gathered. Locals came in for a drink, a chat, and a glimpse of the men whose favor could smooth a problem or whose anger could make life extremely difficult. Those who later spoke to reporters about the place described a kind of careful choreography, who could walk straight up to Anthony, who waited to be beckoned over, who lingered against the wall, listening more than talking. Behind the scenes, his responsibilities were broad. Illegal gambling remained central. Bookmakers operated under the umbrella of his crew, handling bets on everything from horse races to professional sports. Some ran sheet operations, where regular customers would settle up weekly. Others focused on daily action. The numbers game continued to flourish too, despite the eventual introduction of state lotteries. For many New Yorkers, picking a number and hoping for a small windfall was a daily ritual, and the profits from those modest wagers, multiplied across thousands of people, added up quickly. Loan sharking complemented the gambling rackets. The decade's economic turbulence, rising inflation, oil shocks, and a slowdown after the post-war boom left many working-class people and small business owners struggling to make ends meet. Banks were often unwilling to extend credit to those with shaky finances or incomplete paperwork. For some, turning to a local figure like Anthony's crew felt like the only option. The terms were rarely favorable. High interest rates and strict payment schedules could turn a short-term lifeline into a long-term burden. If someone fell badly behind, the pressure to pay intensified. While public accounts do not dwell on specific collection methods, the general pattern, documented across many organized crime cases, was clear. The fear of consequences kept most borrowers from defaulting. According to later court testimony from cooperators, including Anthony's own son, his father's authority in these matters was rarely questioned. Disputes over debts, territory, or the conduct of associates often ended up at his table. There, he would listen, weigh what he had been told, and render a decision. Such judgments might involve redistributing customers between bookmakers, adjusting the terms of a loan, or instructing someone to back off a lucrative contact claimed by another crew. These choices were rarely arbitrary. They reflected a set of unwritten rules designed to keep money flowing smoothly and to minimize open conflict that might attract outside attention. His role extended beyond strictly illegal enterprises. Like many mafia captains of the era, Anthony moved comfortably at the intersection of lawful and unlawful business. Construction projects in Queens and Brooklyn offered opportunities for profit and influence. No-show jobs on sites, labor, consulting, and arrangements in which certain contractors were favored in exchange for kickbacks or cooperation. Trucking, too, provided openings. Control over which companies serviced particular routes or facilities could be leveraged into steady streams of income. While direct documentary evidence of every company he touched is scarce, broader investigations into Gambino-linked operations make clear that captains of his stature were expected to explore and exploit these possibilities. It was during this period that his bond with John Gotti deepened. Gotti, nearly 2 decades younger, was building his own reputation. After serving time in prison in the early 1972 for his role in a Queens kidnapping murder case, he returned to Ozone Park with his stature in some circles paradoxically enhanced. He aligned himself closely with underboss Aniello Della Croce and immersed himself in rackets centered on John F. Kennedy International Airport and surrounding neighborhoods. Hijacking from cargo terminals, selling stolen goods, and skimming from union contracts all became ingredients in the mix. Multiple law enforcement sources and later testimonies placed Gotti and his crew repeatedly at Anthony's bar. Their presence there was not incidental. For an ambitious younger figure, having the favor and counsel of an established captain like Fat Andy offered stability, introductions, and a stronger claim to turf. For Anthony, ties to Gotti's highly active crew meant increased earnings and solid connections to Della Croce's camp within the wider Gambino family. At a time when internal fault lines were beginning to emerge between factions loyal to the traditional Brooklyn base and those more aligned with Manhattan business interests, these relationships mattered. Inside Anthony's own home, that world brushed ever closer against family life. His son, Anthony Jr., came of age in the 1972. In later sworn testimony, the younger Ruggiano described growing up in a household where his father's status was both obvious and only partially explained. He saw the respect people showed his father in the neighborhood, the steady flow of visitors to the house, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. As he got older, he began doing small tasks, driving his father places, delivering envelopes, helping at the bar. What had once been a kind of undefined aura around his father hardened into a clearer understanding that this was not ordinary business. Those early errands turned gradually into deeper involvement. Anthony Jr. would later admit in court that he participated in gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets under his father's supervision, learning, as he put it, the life from someone who had been immersed in it for decades. In describing this process to juries, he emphasized both the pull of loyalty wanting to impress and support his father and the normalization of criminal behavior in their environment. When everyone you look up to operates outside the law, he suggested, illegality can come to feel like the default, not the exception. Outside their doors, the broader city was struggling. New York, in the mid-1972s, teetered on the edge of fiscal collapse. Budget crises led to cuts in essential services. Unemployment rose. Crime statistics climbed sharply. Whole blocks in some boroughs slipped into neglect. For organized crime figures, this chaos had mixed effects. On one hand, the strain on police resources could mean less DUI scrutiny in certain neighborhoods. On the other, the economic pain created both more potential customers for loans and more desperate people willing to take risks, whether by cooperating with law enforcement or by committing robberies and other crimes that might intersect unhelpfully with mafia interests. Law enforcement was not absent, even if stretched thin. In Queens and Brooklyn, state and federal investigators mounted periodic crackdowns on gambling and loan sharking operations. Bar owners were raided. Bookmakers were arrested, cash and betting slips were seized. Newspapers occasionally mentioned these sweeps, listing a handful of names in the charges filed. Anthony's own path through this period included brushes with the law. Over the course of his life, He was arrested multiple times on related charges, but for years, serious convictions eluded prosecutors. Cases were dismissed, witnesses backed away, juries remained unconvinced. To agents watching from the outside, he seemed to glide through legal trouble with a consistency that only deepened their determination to bring a more substantial case. Inside the Gambino family, the decade brought major changes at the top. In 1976, Carlo Gambino died of heart disease. His chosen successor, Paul Castellano, represented a particular vision of mafia power, more focused on white-collar schemes, labor racketeering, and business deals than on the street-level violence and hijackings that had defined earlier eras. Castellano's elevation, however, left many in the so-called blue-collar wingmen like Gotti, rooted in the Brooklyn and Queens crews, feeling sidelined. While there is no public record of Anthony openly opposing Castellano, the web of relationships in which he stood linked him more closely to Dela Croce and the street-oriented faction that simmered under Castellano's rule. These internal tensions rarely surfaced in public during the late 1970s, but FBI informant reports hinted at growing resentments. Castellano's emphasis on discretion and his comfort in Staten Island's affluent Tot Hill area contrasted sharply with the more rough-edged style of captains operating out of modest neighborhood clubs. For someone like Anthony, whose whole life had unfolded in Brooklyn and Queens, the traditional social-low club world remained his primary arena. Yet the strategic decisions made by Castellano at the top, including how to distribute lucrative rackets, which captains to favor, and how aggressively to respond to law enforcement, shaped the environment in which he worked. The government's offense against organized crime was evolving simultaneously. In the late 1970s, federal prosecutors in New York began to experiment with RICO in more ambitious ways. Instead of single defendant trials, they constructed larger indictments that named multiple members of the same family, outlining years of activity in gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering. Tapes from hidden microphones in social clubs and bugged cars started to appear as evidence in courtrooms. While many of those early cases focused on other families, the Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo organizations, the lessons learned would soon be applied to the Gambinos as well. Throughout this period, Anthony's name repeatedly appeared in internal law enforcement documents as a subject of ongoing interest. His alleged involvement in serious acts of violence, described years later by his son and other cooperators, made him a priority target for investigators who were increasingly willing to lean on lower-level participants to turn them into witnesses. Yet the code of silence that had protected the mafia for so long still largely held. Few inside were willing to testify. Those who considered it knew that the social and personal consequences would be profound. Despite the mounting pressure, the daily operations of his crew continued much as they had. Bookmakers paid their share. Borrowers made their installments. Bar owners in his orbit knew whom to call if a problem arose. Anthony was aging into his 50s, but within the culture of Cosa Nostra, that was often when a man's influence peaked. He had decades of experience, an established reputation for decisiveness, and ties to multiple generations within the family, from older figures who remembered Mangano and Anastasia to younger men who saw in him a living bridge to the organization's past. What few outside his circle could see was the toll such a life took. His son would later recall a father who could be affectionate and even playful at home, but who carried a constant weight of worry. There were rival crews to watch, potential police surveillance to consider, rumors to assess. Every arrest of an associate raised questions. Would this person keep quiet? Had any incriminating details been overheard or recorded? When another mob family suffered a major indictment, Gambino leaders studied the charging papers closely, looking for clues about investigative tactics that might soon be used against them. For the moment, in the later 1970s, Anthony and his circle managed to stay a step ahead. The city's attention was consumed by stories of fiscal recovery, the blackout of 1977, and the defeat of the Son of Sam killer. Newspapers printed occasional pieces about mafia trials, but the Gambino family, especially its Queens crews, had not yet been dragged into the kind of sweeping, nationally prominent cases that would define the 1,980 seconds. From the outside, Fat Andy remained what he had long appeared to be, a neighborhood don, deeply rooted in the streets where he had spent almost his entire life, balancing the competing demands of family, crew, and bosses above him. That surface continuity masked a growing vulnerability. The very qualities that had sustained him, loyalty, longevity, and a dense network of relationships, would, in a new era of electronic surveillance and cooperating witnesses, become liabilities. Each associate was a potential link in a chain leading straight to his door. Each conversation in a social club might, unknown to him, be captured on a hidden microphone. As the 1,970 seconds gave way to the 1,980 seconds, the convergence of internal discontent within the Gambino family and external pressure from increasingly sophisticated prosecutors set the stage for a period of upheaval that would test, as never before, the world Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano had spent a lifetime helping to build. In the early 1,980 seconds, the neighborhood around Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's bar did not look like the center of a national drama. Ozone Park, with its modest houses, corner groceries, and lines of parked sedans, could have passed for any working-class district in outer New York. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, the fault lines that would shake the Gambino crime family and reshape Anthony's life were quietly spreading. The federal laws that had once seemed like distant threats were being sharpened into weapons, and the internal strains within the family he served were hardening into factions. By then, Anthony was in his early 60s, a veteran of the organization whose reputation stretched back decades. Younger men in the Gambino family had grown up with his name as part of the underworld vocabulary of Queens and Brooklyn. When they walked into his bar, they understood the etiquette almost instinctively. You did not raise your voice. You did not ask too many questions. You waited to be noticed. The room itself was not elaborate, some tables, a bar, a television, a jukebox, but for those in the life it was a kind of unofficial office, a place where problems were brought and, more often than not, resolved. Outside those walls, the legal environment had changed. RICO, passed in 1970, was no longer new. Prosecutors had spent a decade testing and refining it. By the early 1,980 seconds, they were ready to deploy it against the 5 families in a coordinated way. In Washington, the Department of Justice expanded organized crime strike forces. In New York, U.S., attorneys in both the southern and eastern districts devoted teams of prosecutors and FBI agents to nothing but mafia cases. Wiretaps and hidden microphones, bugs installed under court order, became central tools. Instead of building cases solely around reluctant witnesses, investigators hoped to capture mobsters incriminating themselves in their own words. For someone in Anthony's position, the growing sophistication of law enforcement required adjustments. He and his contemporaries had long warned younger associates to watch what they said on telephones, but now the caution extended further. Conversations in cars, in back rooms, even on sidewalk walks, were viewed with new suspicion. Anthony was, by most accounts, instinctively careful. He preferred face-to-face talks in familiar spaces and discouraged idle chatter about business. Still, no amount of street wisdom could completely insulate him from the new reality. The very social clubs and bars that had long served as the backbone of mafia communication were now prime targets for surveillance. Within the Gambino hierarchy, the early 1,980 seconds were a time of uneasy balance. Paul Castellano, Carlo Gambino's chosen successor, remained boss. From his stately home in Staten Island's Tot Hill, he cultivated an image closer to that of a corporate chief than a traditional neighborhood don. His interests lay heavily in white-collar schemes, control of unions, skimming from construction projects, and influence over large food and garment businesses. At his side as underboss stood Aniel O'Neill Delacroix, a man rooted in the blue-collar, street-level wing of the family, with deep ties in Manhattan's Little Italy and in the Brooklyn and Queens crews. Anthony belonged, by geography and association, firmly to that latter world. His base in Ozone Park, his long friendship with Delacroix, and his growing closeness to John Gotti all linked him to the faction that many described as the old-school Gambino wing. These were men who had come up in the era when hijackings, illegal gambling, and direct control of local businesses defined the life. They did not reject the money that could be made from high-level business racketeering, but they were wary of a style of leadership that seemed increasingly distant from the streets where most of the family's rank and file operated. Gotti's own star was rising fast. After his release from prison in the mid-1972s, he consolidated his position in Queens, particularly around the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in South Ozone Park, not far from Anthony's sphere. Hijacking operations at JFK Airport, loan sharking, and gambling all funneled profits upward through Delacroce's wing. Gotti's charisma, willingness to take risks, and ability to generate income made him a natural focal point for others in that faction. Over time, his crew's presence at Anthony's bar became a fixture, further intertwining their fates. To federal agents monitoring Queens, the clustering of such figures in a relatively small area was both a challenge and an opportunity. It meant that a handful of locations, social clubs, bars, certain restaurants, functioned as crucial nodes in the Gambino network. If those spaces could be penetrated with informants or listening devices, a wealth of information might follow. But securing and installing such devices required meticulous planning and judicial approval, and even then, the microphones could pick up only what was actually said. Mafia culture prized understatement and euphemism. A decision that outsiders might describe as extortion or a planned assault could be couched in vague references and half-sentences, meaningful to the participants but opaque to others. While investigators refined their techniques, the internal tensions inside the Gambino family grew sharper. Castellano's leadership increasingly frustrated some captains in Brooklyn and Queens who felt he favored a smaller circle of relatives and business associates clustered around Staten Island and Manhattan. Stories spread that he disapproved of narcotics at a time when some lower-level figures were tempted by the enormous profits drug dealing could generate. Others resented what they saw as his aloofness. In that environment, men like Anthony, whose power was rooted in the outer boroughs, found themselves navigating a delicate line, loyal, on paper, to Castellano, but socially and historically aligned with Delacroce and his protégés. Delacroce's death from cancer in late 1985 removed a key stabilizing force. Within weeks, the tensions that had been held in check burst into the open in one of the most consequential moments in modern mafia history. On a cold December evening in 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver and underboss Thomas Bellotti were shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. The killings were carried out on a busy street in front of multiple witnesses, an extraordinary breach of the mafia's usual preference for secrecy. Within days, law enforcement and the underworld alike concluded that the move had been engineered by John Gotti and his allies. Anthony was not publicly implicated in planning or carrying out the Sparks hit, and no credible evidence has placed him among the gunmen or spotters. His role was not as a triggerman in that particular drama, but as a veteran captain in a family that had just undergone a violent coup. The news of Castellano's death, spreading rapidly through the city by television, radio, and word of mouth, signaled far more than a change of boss. It announced the arrival of a new style of leadership, embodied by Gotti, that embraced a degree of visibility and public swagger unheard of in the cautious Carlo Gambino years. In the short term, the coup brought opportunity to those close to the new regime. Gotti installed himself as boss, restructured the family's administration, and rewarded loyalists. Captains in the Delacroce camp gained greater access to profitable rackets. For Anthony, who had long operated in Queens under Delacroce's umbrella and had a close relationship with Gotti, the shift meant his status within the family was at least confirmed, if not quietly enhanced. His social club, already a vital hub, became even more important as a meeting point for figures aligned with the new leadership. But the very boldness that thrilled some inside the life had the opposite effect on law enforcement. To FBI agents and prosecutors who had spent years trying to prove, in court, that the Gambino family was a tightly structured organization, Castellano's murder was both a confirmation and an opening. It confirmed that internal disputes could erupt into spectacular violence, and it opened a window to argue that the Gambinos, like their counterparts in other families, fit squarely within the patterns RICO was meant to address. If the top of the pyramid could be toppled in such a public act, then perhaps the entire structure could be targeted as criminal by design. The reaction from the government was swift. Even before Castellano's death, federal prosecutors in Manhattan had filed a sweeping RICO case known as the Commission Trial, targeting the leaders of several five families and accusing them collectively of controlling labor unions and construction rackets. Castellano had been named in that indictment. His murder removed him from the defendant list but did nothing to slow the case. In 1986, the commission trial ended in convictions that sent multiple bosses and high-ranking figures to prison for decades. The message was clear. The era of near-all immunity for mafia leadership was over. Although that particular case did not center on Anthony, it altered the terrain under his feet. Once judges and juries had accepted the idea that the mafia was a coherent enterprise subject to RICO, similar cases against the Gambinos in Brooklyn and Queens became more plausible. Prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, which covers those boroughs and Long Island, took careful note. Their future indictments would name captains and soldiers from Anthony's world, connecting illegal gambling and loan sharking on neighborhood corners to decisions made in family administration meetings. Meanwhile, the Gotti era transformed the public face of the Gambino family. The new boss's immaculate suits, frequent appearances at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, and defiant posture toward the press earned him the nickname the Dapper Don. Later, after a string of courtroom acquittals, the tabloids christened him the Teflon Don. Cameras camped outside his club and his home. Nightly newscasts followed his comings and goings. For men like Anthony, who had spent a lifetime cultivating a lower profile, the spectacle was jarring. The boss of their family had become something akin to a celebrity, and with that celebrity came relentless investigative focus. Yet life in Ozone Park did not stop for national headlines. At Anthony's bar, cards were dealt, drinks were poured, and quiet conversations continued. His crew's core businesses, gambling, loan sharking, and labora-related schemes remained active. But the risks attached to those activities had increased. Each new indictment unsealed against the Gambinos, even when centered on others, raised the stakes for everyone under the same banner. Agents who could not easily get close to Gotti looked more closely at his captains. Operations that might once have drawn only local police attention now landed on the desks of federal prosecutors eager to build broader cases. Within his own family, the pressures of the decade were beginning to show. Anthony Jr., by then an adult and an active participant in his father's crew, was drawn deeper into the life's contradictions. On one hand, he enjoyed the benefits that came with his last name, deference from associates, access to money, and a role in decision-making far beyond what most young men his age could expect. On the other, the same environment exposed him to the darker currents of organized crime culture, substance abuse, constant anxiety about law enforcement, and the strain of maintaining loyalty in a world where suspicion was a daily fact of life. Years later, when he testified in federal court as a cooperating witness, Anthony Jr. would describe the 1,980 seconds as a time when he slid into habitual drug use even as he carried out tasks for his father. Heroin and other narcotics, increasingly available on the streets, pulled at him in ways that his father, committed to traditional mafia rules that frowned on drug dealing, struggled to control. The elder Ruggiano, shaped by an earlier era's codes, reportedly reacted with anger and disappointment to his son's addiction. But the bonds between them, familial and criminal, remained. The younger man continued to operate within his father's crew, reinforcing the interweaving of blood ties and organizational loyalties that would later make his decision to cooperate so devastating. For law enforcement, however, that decision still lay years ahead. Through most of the 1,980 seconds, Anthony's immediate legal fortunes remained, if not untouched, then at least less catastrophic than those of some of his peers. He was arrested and charged at various points in his career on gambling, racketeering, and related counts, but for much of the decade, he managed to avoid the kind of long, definitive prison sentence that federal prosecutors increasingly sought for mafia captains. Cases collapsed when key witnesses refused to testify or proved unreliable. Juries, skeptical of cooperating criminals whose testimony formed the backbone of many prosecutions, acquitted in some instances or deadlocked in others. That pattern of near misses did not mean he was ignored. On the contrary, internal FBI and NYPD documents from the period, later referenced in court and in journalistic accounts, made clear that Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano remained on lists of priority targets. Surveillance teams logged his movements. Informant debriefings included notes about his meetings and statements. In Queens, his bar figured again and again as a site of interest, its routine rhythm punctuated by the quiet clicks of Long Gellen's cameras and the scratch of agents' pens in unmarked cars. At the same time, the texture of everyday life in his neighborhoods continued to bear the imprint of his crew's activities. Some local residents, especially those who benefited from his occasional generosity, spoke of him as a kind of rough community pillar, someone who could be approached when a landlord refused to make repairs, or when a relative needed a job. Others, particularly those who had fallen into debt or had seen friends pressured and harmed, understood more keenly the costs of his influence. Fear rarely announced itself openly. It showed up instead in the way people lowered their voices when his name came up, or stepped aside when he entered a room. The late 1980 seconds brought new tremors. In 1987, a federal jury in Brooklyn convicted a group of Gambino figures, including John Gotti's close associate Angelo Ruggiero, on narcotics and racketeering charges. Though the case did not directly name Anthony, it further demonstrated prosecutors' willingness to tie high-ranking Gambinos to wide-ranging conspiracies. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, repeated attempts to convict Gotti himself on racketeering and related charges failed, reinforcing his Teflon image, but also spurring prosecutors to redouble their efforts. In the midst of this turmoil, Anthony's age and experience gave him a kind of grim perspective. He had seen bosses rise and fall, wars start and end, crackdowns come and go. But the combination now confronting him, a media-savvy boss whose very visibility drew investigative fire, a federal legal apparatus honed by RICO's successes, and a slowly eroding code of silence within the mafia, was something new. The collapses of other families' inner circles in the wake of big trials showed that once one insider agreed to talk, more often followed. Each new cooperating witness, testifying to the structure and practices of Cosa Nostra, made it easier for prosecutors to persuade juries that men like Anthony belonged not to a collection of isolated street crews, but to a single, organized criminal enterprise. By the close of the decade, the stage was set for an even more intense confrontation. Prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan had learned where the Gambinos gathered, how their lines of authority ran, and which operations generated the most money. Gotti's fame ensured that any successful case against him would be front-page news, but the same investigations that focused on the boss inevitably swept through the ranks beneath him. As the 1980 seconds tipped into the 1990 seconds, Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano, once a boy in Depression-era Brooklyn, now a well-known captain in a family under siege, found himself moving into a final, more precarious phase of his criminal career, in which the habits and loyalties of a lifetime would collide with a justice system more determined and better equipped than any he had faced before. In the early 1990 seconds, the quiet routines around Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's Queens base carried on much as they had for years. The bar in Ozone Park still opened in the afternoon. Regulars still drifted in for drinks and cards, and the familiar faces of bookmakers, couriers, and neighborhood figures continued to appear and disappear with a practiced lack of fuss. To someone walking past on Cross Bay Boulevard or Liberty Avenue, it might have seemed as if nothing much had changed since the 1970 seconds. In reality, almost everything had changed. The turning point for the Gambino family, and by extension for Anthony, came in December 1990, when the FBI finally made its move against John Gotti. For months, Agents had been recording conversations at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where Gotti liked to hold court. Tiny microphones hidden in walls and upstairs apartments captured hours of muffled but usable speech. On those tapes, prosecutors later argued the boss of the Gambinos could be heard discussing the inner workings of the family, criticizing subordinates, and referring to past acts of violence. When Gotti was arrested that winter, along with consigliere Frank Locascio and powerful underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano, the news flashed everywhere. Television cameras caught him being led into custody, dressed in the impeccable suits that had become part of his public image. For older captains like Anthony, who had spent their lives avoiding that kind of spectacle, the sight was both sobering and ominous. The government had not only indicted the boss, it claimed to have him on tape talking about family business. Even more destabilizing was what happened next. In 1991, Gravano agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. His decision to break the mafia's code of silence was a shock to Cosa Nostra across the country. A man who had been at the very center of Gambino operations now described under oath how the family functioned, who made which decisions, and how acts of violence were approved and carried out. As part of his testimony, he placed Gotti at the top of a hierarchy that prosecutors argued fit squarely within the RICO framework. By April 1992, Gotti and Locascio had been convicted on racketeering and related charges and sentenced to life in federal prison. For the Gambino family, it was the most severe legal blow they had ever sustained. For Anthony, who had known Gotti for years and benefited from their alliance in Queens, the conviction signaled that the rules of engagement with law enforcement had shifted decisively. Under Carlo Gambino and even Paul Castellano, bosses had been investigated certainly, but not convicted in such high-profile, sweeping cases. Now the government had shown that it could bring down the top of the pyramid and was clearly intent on continuing down the structure. The attention did not stop at the Ravenites' door. In the years after Gotti's conviction, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan rolled out a series of RICO cases targeting Gambino captains and soldiers. These indictments often cited not just individual acts, an illegal gambling operation here, a loan-sharking conspiracy there, but patterns of behavior stretching back years. The government's aim was to show that the Gambino family, like the other New York families, was an ongoing enterprise whose members coordinated to extract money from businesses and individuals through a mix of illegal betting, high-interest loans, labor racketeering, and threats. Anthony's name appeared with increasing frequency in these documents. To agents who had watched him for decades, he was no longer just a neighborhood power broker. He was a seasoned captain in what they now routinely referred to as the Gambino crime family enterprise. Early in the decade, he was charged in federal court on racketeering-related counts tied to gambling and loan-sharking schemes in Queens. The charges reflected what investigators believed he had been doing for years, overseeing bookmakers who took bets on sports and numbers, extending credit at steep rates to people who could not secure bank loans, and ensuring that all of these operations produced steady payments that flowed upward. The charging papers, stripped of romance, presented a stark portrait. They described a structure in which customers who fell behind on payments could expect visits from associates of Anthony's crew. Those associates, the government alleged, made clear that missing installments was not an option. The filings did not dwell on graphic details. They did not need to. The implication was clear enough. The fear of consequences, honed over years in neighborhoods like Ozone Park, was the backbone of the business model. Facing such indictments, men of Anthony's generation had limited options. Cooperation with the government could vastly reduce a sentence, but at a profound personal cost. Testifying meant betraying not only colleagues but often relatives and lifelong friends. It meant entering witness protection, leaving behind family, status, and the familiar grid of streets in which they had spent their entire lives. For a man like Anthony, who had gone through the formal mafia induction ceremony in the 1,950 seconds and lived by its rules for decades, such a step was unthinkable. Instead, like many of his peers, he fought some charges and negotiated pleas on others. In one federal case, He ultimately admitted to a racketeering conspiracy count connected to the kinds of gambling and loan operations that had long been associated with his name. Given his age, he was now in his 70s, and the accumulating health problems that often accompany a life under constant stress, the sentence he received effectively guaranteed that he would spend much, if not all, of his remaining years under federal supervision, either in prison or in closely monitored settings. While the government targeted him in courtrooms, shifting dynamics within his own family complicated his world further. His son, Anthony Jr., who had grown up idolizing his father and embracing the life, was facing his own legal and personal crises. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the younger Ruggiano's involvement in crime deepened. He became, by his own later admission, a functioning addict, heavily involved with narcotics, while continuing to engage in loan sharking, gambling, and other rackets as part of his father's crew. The combination proved destructive. Drug use destabilized his judgment, made him more conspicuous to law enforcement, and set him at odds with the older generation's code, which officially condemned involvement with narcotics. The elder Anthony, shaped by habits formed in the era when bosses like Carlo Gambino considered drug dealing reckless and dangerous, struggled to reconcile his love for his son with his disgust at addiction's effects. Those close to the family later recalled arguments, failed attempts at getting clean, and an undercurrent of sadness beneath the public image of a united, formidable clan. From the perspective of outside observers, agents, prosecutors, and journalists, the generational disconnect inside the Ruggiano household mirrored a broader pattern in organized crime. Many younger mob figures in the 1980s and 1990s were less bound by old taboos than their fathers and uncles had been. Some dabbled in narcotics, attracted by the fast profits. Others proved more willing to cooperate with the government when faced with long sentences. Each such cooperation chipped away at the code of silence that had protected men like Anthony for so long. The most dramatic example of that erosion was, of course, Sammy Gravano. But he was far from alone. Across the 5 families, dozens of insiders turned government witness in the 1990 seconds. With each new cooperating witness, prosecutors gained more insight into the inner workings of Cosa Nostra. Charts that had once been educated guesses, lines drawn by analysts between names on an FBI board, began to reflect specific conversations and meetings, described in detail by people who had been there. Although Anthony never broke ranks, the testimony of these cooperators eventually caught up with him indirectly. Among those who spoke to the government in the late 1990 seconds was Salvatore Fat Sal Mangiavillano, a former Gambino associate who described meetings, money drops, and the roles of various captains. Later, in the 2000s, Anthony Jr. would add his own memories to the record. But even before his cooperation, prosecutors had accumulated enough second-hand accounts to paint a consistent picture. Fat Andy Ruggiano was, in their view, a longtime capo whose authority in Queens stretched back to the heyday of Carlo Gambino. In public, however, Anthony maintained the demeanor he had cultivated for decades. Even as legal troubles mounted, he was described by those who saw him as calm, courteous, and controlled. He did not rant about prosecutors in front of strangers. He did not give defiant press conferences on courthouse steps. His style remained the traditional one: deal with problems quietly, present a united front with family, and never admit more than necessary in any official setting. Federal custody, though, was a different world. For older mobsters used to neighborhood clubs and familiar restaurants, the move into higher security facilities like the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan or the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn was jarring. Inside, reputation still mattered, especially among other inmates from organized crime backgrounds, but the rhythms of prison life were brutally simple: counts, lockdowns, visits, commissary, the slow passage of time. Health issues that might have been manageable on the outside often worsened. Years of stress, heavy smoking, drinking, or poor diet caught up with men in their 60s and 70s. Anthony's health began to fail in this period. By the late 1990 seconds, he was suffering from serious medical problems, public reports would later cite illnesses consistent with heart disease and cancer. The Bureau of Prisons transferred him to facilities better equipped to handle inmates in declining condition, including prison medical centers where the population skewed older and sicker. For a man who had once held court in a bustling Queens bar, surrounded by deferential associates, such surroundings underscored how far his circumstances had shifted. Yet even as his body weakened, he held to the code that had defined his life. There is no evidence that he ever considered cooperation, unlike some contemporaries who chose to testify in exchange for earlier release. Anthony accepted his sentence as the cost of the life he had embraced. Those who later spoke about him, from his son to former associates, emphasized this point. For all the harm he had done, and for all the ways in which his choices had entangled others in violent and coercive enterprises, he remained, to the end, a believer in the old rules of Cosa Nostra. On the streets he left behind, however, those rules were fraying. Younger Gambinos stepped into roles vacated by imprisoned or deceased captains, but their world was not the same one Anthony had navigated in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. Law enforcement had digitized records, improved surveillance technology, and integrated local, state, and federal investigations. Rackets that had once seemed secure control over certain unions, monopoly contracts in construction, were now regularly exposed in press conferences featuring U.S. attorneys flanked by agents from multiple agencies. In Queens, the social landscape of neighborhoods like Ozone Park and Howard Beach also evolved. New immigrant groups moved in, property values shifted, some old storefronts closed, bars that had once been unofficial command posts changed hands, rebranded, or shuttered entirely. For residents who had grown up in the shadow of men like Fat Andy, there was a sense that an era, for better and worse, was passing. The legal system's view of Anthony hardened further in the late 1990 seconds as cooperating witnesses filled in more details about his past. When Anthony Jr. eventually took the stand in the 2000s, he would testify that his father had been involved in multiple killings over the decades, putting the number at 7. He named some of the victims and outlined the circumstances in which violence had been used to protect the family's interests. In doing so, he transformed his father's reputation from that of a quiet, feared neighborhood figure into something more concrete in the public record, not just a captain in a racketeering enterprise, but in the eyes of the law, a man responsible for repeated, deadly acts. For the moment, though, as the 1990 seconds drew to a close, that testimony still lay in the future. Anthony spent his final years in custody, far from the streets where he had built his life and reputation. In March 1999, at the age of 78, he died while still under federal authority, in a prison medical facility rather than at home in Queens. The boy born in 1921 into a crowded Brooklyn apartment, who had climbed through the ranks of one of America's most notorious criminal organizations, did not live to see the full extent to which his name would later be dissected in open court. A man whose choices, preserved in the memories of his son and others, would become a crucial window into the fading world he had helped to shape. When Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano died in federal custody in 1999, it might have seemed on paper like the closing of a file. The Bureau of Prisons moved his record to the category reserved for deceased inmates. Old FBI memos that had once tracked his movements and phone calls were boxed and pushed deeper into archives. In Queens, the bar that had been his informal headquarters shifted slowly into new hands and, over time, a different kind of clientele. The man at the center of it all was gone, yet in a strange way, his story was only entering its most public phase. For almost half a century, the picture law enforcement had of Anthony came mostly from the outside. Surveillance logs describing who came and went from his bar, informants' secondhand stories, the occasional intercepted call. Agents knew he was important. They knew he was close to John Gotti and Aniello Della Croce. They believed he had sanctioned or taken part in acts of violence. But the details were hazy, inferred rather than confirmed. The people who really knew how his crew worked, his soldiers, his close associates, and his family, had stayed silent. The new millennium broke that silence. In the early 2000s, As prosecutors kept up relentless pressure on the Gambino family, a familiar pattern repeated itself. Lower-level figures were arrested on gambling, loan sharking, and racketeering charges. Some chose to fight and risk long sentences. Others, seeing the weight of evidence against them and knowing how previous RICO trials had ended, made a different choice. They agreed to cooperate. Each cooperation began the same way, with long debriefing sessions in anonymous federal offices or safe houses, where agents and prosecutors asked over and over, who else was there? Who gave the order? Who collected the money? Among the most significant of these new voices was Anthony's own son. By the time he was approached by the government, Anthony Jr. was in deep trouble. Years of involvement in his father's crew had left him with a string of arrests and serious pending charges. At the same time, his long struggle with drug addiction had eroded his standing inside the life. The qualities his father's generation prized, discipline, reliability, the ability to keep one's word, had been compromised by heroin and other substances. He had disappointed his father, frightened his family, and made himself a liability in a world that had little patience for weakness. For a long time, the idea of testifying against people he had grown up around, including men who had treated him like a son, was unthinkable. He had taken the same oath his father had taken, albeit in a very different era, and had been raised to view cooperation with law enforcement as the ultimate betrayal. But as the 1,990 seconds bled into the 2000s, the sheer weight of his circumstances began to press in. The sentences he faced, if convicted at trial, were measured in decades. His health was deteriorating. His addiction, he later admitted, had brought him to the edge of losing everything anyway. In that context, his eventual decision to cooperate was both a personal collapse and a turning point in the historical record of his father's life. When he sat down with federal agents for the first time, he carried with him decades of observation, childhood memories of his father's bar, teenage errands run for seasoned mobsters, adult participation in rackets supervised by Anthony's crew. Piece by piece, in interview after interview, he laid that world out. Some of what he described confirmed what investigators had long suspected. His father, he said, had been a made member of the Gambino family for as long as he could remember, inducted in the mid-20th century and eventually promoted to captain. The Ozone Park Bar had indeed served as a headquarters where bets were settled, debts collected, and conflicts mediated. The men who came and went there, the bookmakers, enforcers, and other captains, took direction from his father and in turn passed money on to high-ranking figures, including Gotti. Other details, however, gave the first clear, inside-out view of Anthony's role in serious violence. Under questioning, Anthony Jr. said that his father had been directly involved in multiple killings over the years, giving the number as 7. He named some of the victims and sketched the reasons behind the decisions. A man who had stolen from the family, another suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, still others who had become liabilities in long-running disputes. The specifics were often painful for him to recount. These were not abstract case studies. They were events he had heard discussed in his own kitchen, side comments made during car rides, sometimes stories told to impress or warn him as a young man. When those debriefings gave way to formal testimony in open court, the public finally heard these accounts. In the mid-2000s, Anthony Jr. appeared as a key witness in a series of federal trials against alleged Gambino members and associates. Under direct examination, he explained the basic structure of the family, the meaning of terms like soldier, capo, and consigliere, and the importance of the oath his father had taken. Then prosecutors turned to the heart of the matter, his father's career. Calmly, often in a flat, resigned tone, he told juries how his father had risen from neighborhood tough to respected captain, how he had controlled illegal gambling and loan sharking in parts of Queens and Brooklyn, and how, behind the facade of a family man and bar owner, he had been, in his son's words, a killer as well as a provider. The courtroom transcripts captured moments of especially stark contrast. The son recalling holidays and barbecues, gifts and small kindnesses, in the same breath as he acknowledged that the man he loved had approved and participated in fatal acts. Reporters in the gallery seized on that contrast. Newspaper articles about his testimony framed it as a window into the mob family dynamic, the way children were drawn into the life through a mix of love, intimidation, and normalization of criminal behavior. Headlines highlighted his admission that he had once idolized his father for his reputation and feared letting him down more than he feared prison. Some pieces quoted his description of learning to see violence and extortion as simply how things were done, only later recognizing the human cost of those decisions. For law enforcement, his words had a more immediate, tactical value. Each killing he described, each meeting he placed his father at, helped to support broader RICO narratives about how the Gambino family enforced discipline and protected its rackets. Even when Anthony himself could no longer be charged, either because he was dead or because statutes of limitations had run on certain offenses, the stories about him reinforced prosecutors' arguments that the organization as a whole was built on intimidation and coercion. The impact of this testimony reached beyond the individual trials in which it was given. In pre-sentence memos, prosecutors began to refer to Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano, not just as a name on past surveillance reports, but as a central figure in a network of violence and racketeering stretching over decades. When arguing for stiff sentences against younger Gambinos who had come up under or alongside his crew, they used his story as a kind of template. This, they said, is how the older generation did business. This is the culture the defendants had chosen to join. At the same time, the families of some victims whose names surfaced in court experienced a different kind of reckoning. For years, many had known only the barest outlines of what had happened to their loved ones. A body found in a car, a relative who vanished and was later presumed dead, a killing reported in a few lines of crime beat copy. When cooperating witnesses like Anthony Jr. described the motives and deliberations behind some of those events, a bitter clarity followed. There was, in some cases, a measure of vindication in hearing an insider finally admit what law enforcement had long believed. But there was also fresh grief in being confronted, decades on, with the casual way decisions about life and death had been discussed in clubs and back rooms. For historians and criminologists, the materials that emerged from these trials, transcripts, exhibits, and investigative reports became rich sources for understanding not only Anthony's life, but the evolution of the American mafia more broadly. Here was a man whose career spanned from the shadow of prohibition through the age of RICO, whose personal relationships touched major figures like Della Croce and Gotti, and whose family produced one of the more candid insider accounts of day-with-dough mafia existence. By reading Anthony Jr.'s testimony alongside earlier FBI files, researchers could trace how social clubs functioned as command centers, how loan sharking and gambling revenues were calculated and divided, and how authority was transmitted from one generation to the next. They could also see the contradictions that had always run through that world. Anthony had provided for his family, paid for medical bills, and, in his son's telling, shown genuine affection and concern at home. Those same hands had signed off on actions that terrorized other families and left permanent absences at other tables. The code he lived by demanded absolute loyalty to the organization and forbade cooperation with the state. Yet the very secrecy that code enforced meant that when the truth finally surfaced, it did so in bursts of damning detail rather than in a more measured public accounting. As the 2000s went on, the Gambino family itself continued to shrink under legal pressure. Multi-defendant indictments in 2004, 2008, and later years targeted remaining captains and soldiers, often building on the foundation laid by earlier cooperators. Wiretaps, surveillance photographs, and seized betting records were now paired with the kind of inside testimony that had once been almost impossible to obtain. In hearing after hearing, the name Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano resurfaced not as a defendant but as a reference point, a figure whose reign in Queens provided context for the charges against those who had followed him. In Queens and Brooklyn, the neighborhoods he had dominated also changed. The Italian-American demographic core that had fed the Gambino ranks for decades shrank as younger generations moved to the suburbs or pursued college and professional careers. New immigrant communities from Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean brought different networks and different forms of informal authority. While some vestiges of traditional Cosa Nostra influence lingered in construction sites, in certain unions, in a handful of social clubs, the dense overlap of neighborhood, family, and mafia that had defined Anthony's world in the mid-20th century became harder to sustain. Meanwhile, popular culture continued to romanticize and dissect the mafia, with television series and films depicting fictional versions of men not unlike Anthony. Viewers watched morally conflicted mob bosses in suburban New Jersey or carefully drawn godfathers in mid-century New York and debated questions of loyalty and honor. Against that backdrop, the plain language of cooperating witnesses stood in sharp relief. When his son told a jury that his father was both a devoted parent and a man deeply involved in coercive, often deadly rackets, it undercut any easy glamorization. The charm and rituals were there, but so were the betrayals, the addictions, and the quiet devastation left in their wake. For Anthony Jr. himself, life after cooperation was a long process of adjustment. He entered the same witness protection system that had sheltered other former mobsters turned government witnesses. Names were changed, locations shifted, and daily life was circumscribed by security considerations and the knowledge that old associates, even if much of the structure they had served was gone, might still bear grudges. At the same time, he fought to maintain sobriety and to redefine himself outside of the identity that had shaped his first half-century, not as Fat Andy's son, not as a Gambino associate, but as someone trying, however imperfectly, to account for damage done. In interviews he later gave outside the courtroom, long after the trials were over, he spoke with a mixture of regret and lingering loyalty about his father. He did not excuse what Anthony had done, nor did he try to soften the facts he had placed on the record. But he also refused to reduce him to a single dimension. To him, his father remained the man who had taken him to ball games, who had tried within the distorted logic of the life to steer him away from drugs, who had prided himself on keeping up his end of a code that in the world they inhabited was considered paramount. This duality, the ability to be both loving and deeply harmful, principled in one sense and destructive in another, became one of the central themes in how historians and journalists have since portrayed Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano. He was not, and cannot honestly be presented as, a mere victim of circumstances. The path he took into organized crime was shaped by poverty and prejudice, yes, but it was also sustained by a series of adult choices made over decades. At numerous points in his career, he could have stepped back, shifted into legitimate business, or refused to go along with certain acts. He chose instead to deepen his involvement, to accept and wield the power that came from being a Gambino captain. Yet the environment that enabled those choices, the tightly knit enclaves, the limited economic opportunities, the interlocking systems of patronage and fear, was a product of broader historical forces beyond any one man's control. In tracing his life from the 1,920 seconds to the 1,990 seconds and then through the courtroom echoes of the 2000s, what emerges is not a tidy morality tale, but a complex portrait of how individual agency and structural conditions interact. Anthony was both actor and product, shaping his corner of New York's underworld, even as he was shaped by the city's inequalities and the long, tangled history of migration and marginalization that gave birth to American Cosa Nostra in the first place. By the time the first decade of the 21st century closed, most of the men who had shared his formative years in the Gambino family were dead, imprisoned, or living quietly on the margins of their old world. The name Fat Andy no longer prompted cautious glances in Queens bars. It appeared instead in footnotes, trial exhibits, and the recollections of a son trying to explain, to courts and to himself, how an ordinary-seeming father could also have been, for so long, a quiet architect of fear. The man was gone, but the questions his life raised for communities, for the justice system, and for a country still drawn to the dark allure of organized crime stories remained, demanding a reckoning that continued well into the new century. In the years after Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's death, the arc of his life kept unfolding not in the streets of Queens anymore, but but in courtrooms, archives, and eventually in the broad, unruly space of public memory. Where once his story had been carried in whispers in back rooms and half-told anecdotes over drinks, it was now laid out in official transcripts, prosecutors' memos, and recorded interviews that anyone with enough patience could read or watch. The man who had spent a lifetime cultivating secrecy became, after his death, one of the most documented Gambino captains of his generation. Much of that visibility came from the continuing prosecutions of the Gambino family in the 2000s. Each new racketeering indictment against surviving captains and soldiers reached backward, reaching into decades when Anthony had been active. Prosecutors did not have to guess about those years anymore. They now had testimony from people who had walked in and out of his bar, taken his orders, or grown up in his household. When they described how a loan sharking operation worked in Ozone Park, or how a dispute among bookmakers was resolved, they could attach names and dates, and more often than not, Fat Andy appeared somewhere in the background. In one such case, a federal indictment unsealed in Brooklyn listed a roster of Gambino figures accused of racketeering and gambling loans and labor schemes stretching back into the 1982 and early 1990s. In the narrative section, laying out the history of the enterprise, prosecutors referred to deceased captains who had previously controlled certain territories. There among them was Anthony's name, identified as a long-time capo whose crew had once dominated parts of Queens. He was beyond the reach of any new charge, but his career was used as a reference point, a marker along the family's organizational timeline. That use of his story served a legal purpose. RICO cases depend on showing continuity, an organization that does not disband after each crime but endures, passing methods and authority from one generation to the next. For federal attorneys arguing in front of juries who might not remember the headlines of the 1982 and 1990s, anchoring newer defendants in the legacy of men like Fat Andy helped explain why the government spoke of an enterprise rather than a collection of separate criminals. Here, they suggested, was how it looked across time. The captain who ran this neighborhood for decades, his son who came up under him, the younger men who stepped in when prison or death removed the old guard. As those arguments played out in court, journalists and writers picked up the threads. Crime reporters who had spent their careers covering the mafia people like Jerry Capisci in New York had long files on Anthony, compiled from police sources, earlier indictments, and neighborhood rumor. Now they could add quotations from his son's testimony, filling in the silhouettes with sharper lines. Books on the Gambino family and on American organized crime more broadly folded his story into larger narratives about the rise and weakening of Cosa Nostra, citing him as an example of the traditional, old-school captain who bridged the Mangano, Gambino, and Gotti eras. In those accounts, a pattern emerged. Anthony's life was presented as emblematic of a certain type, a man born into the harsh conditions of early 20th century New York, drawn into local rackets as a teenager, inducted into the mafia when it was still consolidating its modern structure, and then carried along as the institution grew wealthy, clashed with law enforcement, and finally fractured under legal and social pressure. His longevity, stretching from the 1940 seconds into the 1990 seconds, made him a useful lens through which to see changes in both the underworld and the city itself. At the same time, academic researchers were using his case, and others like it, to explore the complex relationship between organized crime and immigrant communities. Sociologists and historians who wrote about Italian-American neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens used his bar and his crew as concrete examples when discussing how local power worked in those spaces. They traced how a figure like Fat Andy could function simultaneously as an unofficial arbiter, a predatory lender, and a symbol of resistance to outside authority. In their accounts, residents' memories of him and his contemporaries were often deeply ambivalent. Some people recalled holiday envelopes, help with short-term crises, or the sense that certain blocks were kept in line, and therefore safer from random street crime. Others remembered the fear of angering the wrong person, the knowledge that going to the police about certain problems was simply not done, and the long-term damage caused when small businesses were drained by steep interest payments or quiet extortion. Anthony's legacy, in this view, was not one of simple protection or simple exploitation, but of a complicated, often coercive form of neighborhood governance that thrived in the gaps left by unequal access to law, credit, and political influence. For people who had lost relatives to mafia violence, people whose loved ones were among those 7 killings, Anthony's son attributed to his father in court, the idea of him as a folk figure or community patriarch rang hollow. In victims' families, the scars persisted long after his bar changed names and his crew was broken up. Some learned, only when cooperators testified, that a father's or brother's death, once written off by authorities as an unsolved homicide or a vague underworld hit, had actually been the result of a specific decision taken by men sitting at tables in places like Ozone Park. For them, the new openness about the past brought closure of a sort, but also a renewed sense of anger at how easily a handful of men had been able to reshape the lives of so many others. Some of those relatives became quiet but persistent voices in discussions about parole, sentencing, and organized crime policy. When younger defendants with ties to the Gambino family came up for bail hearings or sentencing in the 2000s and 2010 seconds, victim impact statements sometimes invoked earlier eras, reminding judges that the families involved had long histories of using intimidation and, at times, lethal force to protect their interests. Even when Anthony himself was not mentioned by name, the shadow of his generation hung over the proceedings. He represented to many the template against which the sincerity of later defendants' claims of reform or distance from violence were measured. In a different arena, the emerging world of online media, Anthony's story found yet another afterlife. As the internet matured and platforms like YouTube created new spaces for long-form conversation, a small but notable group of former mobsters and family members began telling their stories directly to audiences. Among them was Anthony's son, who appeared in interviews and created his own content, recounting his journey from mob prince to cooperating witness, and, eventually, to someone trying to steer others away from the choices he had made. In those videos and podcasts, the elder Ruggiano's name surfaced repeatedly. The younger man described his father's power in Queens, the respect and fear he commanded, and the ways in which he had tried, however inconsistently, to keep his children from repeating his mistakes. He spoke about visiting his father in prison, about the pain of testifying, and about the complicated love he still felt for a man he knew had been responsible for terrible acts. Viewers who might once have encountered Fat Andy only as a footnote in a true crime book or a name in a documentary now heard about him through the voice of someone who had known him as Dad. Those personal accounts added texture to a figure who might otherwise have remained a stereotype. They revealed, without excusing, the human side of someone who had spent most of his adult life inside an institution built on intimidation. Anthony was, by his son's telling, not a caricature of cruelty, but a person who could be generous, angry, proud, stubborn, and at times quietly afraid. He worried about law enforcement, about betrayal, about his son's drug use, about aging out of a role that had defined him. For all the damage he caused, he was not immune to the anxiety and regret that come with living under constant threat. In bringing those nuances to light, the son's public reflections unintentionally highlighted one of the paradoxes of organized crime history. The very same loyalty and silence that had allowed men like Anthony to operate unchallenged for so long also ensured that, once that silence was broken, their stories would be told most vividly by those closest to them, the people who had been both their beneficiaries and their collateral damage. When such insiders later decided to cooperate, or simply to speak openly years after the fact, they supplied the public with something law enforcement alone could not provide: an intimate sense of how someone could live for decades inside a world of extortion and violence, while still seeing himself, in some respects, as a decent man. For the broader justice system, the long arc of the Ruggiano story held practical lessons. His case underscored how patient, cumulative investigations, combined with legal tools like RICO and the cultivation of insider witnesses, could eventually penetrate even the most insular crews. It demonstrated the value and the ethical complexity of offering leniency to cooperating criminals in exchange for testimony about more senior figures. Every time prosecutors cited Anthony Jr.'s accounts of his father's crimes, they also had to acknowledge that they were relying on someone who had himself participated in serious offenses. The moral accounting was rarely tidy, but the information extracted in this way contributed to a significant weakening of the very organizations that had once seemed almost untouchable. Policy debates reflected this tension. Critics of the RICO and witness protection model argued that turning criminals into government witnesses risked rewarding some very serious offenders, while supporters pointed out that without such cooperation, men like Fat Andy and the structures they served would likely have continued operating with little real consequence. In committee hearings and scholarly articles, his case was sometimes cited, implicitly or explicitly, as evidence that the trade-off, however uncomfortable, had produced tangible public safety gains. Neighborhoods once dominated by a single crew's loan sharking and gambling could, over time, diversify economically and politically as that crew's influence was eroded. Within Italian-American communities themselves, Anthony's legacy was part of a larger effort to disentangle cultural pride from the baggage of mafia notoriety. Community leaders, educators, and historians emphasized that men like him represented only a tiny fraction of the millions of Italian immigrants and their descendants who had built lives in the United States through legal work. They acknowledged the historical reality of Cosa Nostra while rejecting its claim to speak for or protect the Italian people. In lectures and museum exhibits, they pointed out that Italian Americans had often been among the victims of organized crime, targeted by loan sharks and extortionists operating inside their own neighborhoods. Yet even as those communities worked to assert a broader, more positive story, the fascination with figures like Fat Andy persisted in popular culture. True crime television series produced episodes focused on the Gambino family, sometimes using real photographs of Anthony and his crew, reenactments of scenes in his bar, and snippets of courtroom testimony. The tone of these programs varied widely, from cautiously analytic to sensational, but their existence testified to a durable public appetite for mafia narratives, stories that straddled the line between history and entertainment. How such portrayals affected public understanding of someone like Anthony is difficult to measure. In trying to balance grit and intrigue, many documentaries framed him as one more player in a familiar saga of bosses and betrayals, giving only limited space to the more mundane yet destructive aspects of his work. The day-to-day pressure on debtors, the way a neighborhood's economy could be quietly bent around the needs of a loan shark crew, the generational trauma that followed children of mobsters into their own adulthood. The richness of the historical record, its details about how a child in Depression-era Brooklyn became a captain in a powerful criminal organization, often had to be compressed into a few minutes of screen time. For those willing to look more closely, however, Anthony's life provided a case study in the long reach of structural inequality and the capacity of law and policy to respond, however belatedly, to entrenched criminal systems. His ascent from the tenements to a position of illicit power exposed the vulnerabilities in early 20th century urban America. The lack of effective labor protections, the distrust between immigrant communities and law enforcement, and the ease with which parallel systems of authority could take root in the cracks. His eventual fall reflected the maturation of democratic institutions, courts willing to treat organized crime as a systemic problem rather than a series of isolated incidents, legislators willing to craft specialized laws, and communities increasingly prepared to cooperate with investigations once the mystique of invincibility had been punctured. Seen across this full arc, Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's legacy resists simple labels. He was, undeniably, a career criminal who used fear to extract money and compliance, and whose actions contributed directly and indirectly to pain and loss. He was also a son of immigrants, shaped by the particular hardships and prejudices of his time, who found in the mafia a route to security and status that other avenues seemed to deny. He left behind both victims and relatives who remembered his kindness, both devastated families and a son who, after exposing his father's crimes, still wrestled with his love for the man. In that complexity lies much of the enduring interest in his story. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions about how societies create and confront power outside the law, about the ways in which personal loyalty can coexist with public harm, and about what it means, in the end, to hold someone like Anthony accountable not only in terms of legal punishment, which he received, but in terms of how history itself will remember and judge him. Long after the last federal indictment bearing his name was filed and the last surveillance photograph of his bar yellowed in some evidence box, the story of Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano continued to move quietly through the places he had once dominated. In certain corners of Queens, older residents sitting in cafes or on park benches still told younger listeners, half serious and half nostalgic, about the way things used to be on those blocks about the bar where you didn't raise your voice, the man whose approval could open doors and whose anger could slam them shut. For people who had lived through the years of his influence, the name still meant something concrete. A face at a table, a presence on the sidewalk, a sense that power in the neighborhood flowed, in part, through him. For others, especially those born after his death in 1999, the name reached them in a very different way. They encountered it in crime documentaries, in court transcripts posted online, or through the YouTube stories of his son. To them, Ruggiano was not the man at the end of the bar, but a figure from an earlier chapter in New York's history, a man whose choices and reputation had been captured, paradoxically, by the very institutions he had spent a lifetime trying to evade: the courts, the press, and the official records of the state. The distance between those two versions, the living presence and the historical subject, highlights how much changed around him, and because of him, over the course of the 20th century. When he was a boy in Brooklyn, Italian-American neighborhoods often distrusted the police and courts, seeing them as hostile or indifferent to their needs. Men like the early generation of mob leaders stepped into that vacuum, presenting themselves as protectors and problem solvers. By the time Anthony reached adulthood, that kind of neighborhood power was a familiar fact of life. Children learned early whom to avoid offending, which storefronts to steer clear of, and where to turn if official channels failed. His decision to embrace that world, to move from being a kid on the corner to a formal soldier and eventually a captain in the Gambino family, was rooted in that context but not predetermined by it. Many of his contemporaries, raised in the same crowded apartments and facing the same prejudices, chose different paths: factory work, civil service jobs, small businesses painstakingly built over years. What set Anthony and men like him apart was their willingness to treat intimidation and, at times, lethal violence as tools of trade. In return, they received not only money but something harder to quantify: recognition, influence, and the knowledge that, in their immediate surroundings, their word carried the force of law. For decades, that informal authority operated alongside, and often in opposition to, the authority of the state. When police officers walked through his territory, their presence could feel almost secondary. A shopkeeper might worry more about falling behind on a loan shark payment than about a code of enforcement fine. A teenager tempted to report a shakedown to the authorities would weigh, consciously or not, the likelihood of official protection against the near-certain consequences of being labeled an informer. In that calculation, the presence of someone like Fat Andy, reachable, decisive, and feared, tilted the scales. That balance began to shift in the later decades of his life, not because the mafia suddenly grew less determined, but because the state finally adapted. Ruggiano's career roughly spanned the period in which American law enforcement moved from treating organized crime as a series of localized problems to understanding it as a national, structured phenomenon. When he started out, federal agencies were fragmented and, at times, willfully blind. By the end, they were coordinating multi-year investigations that reached from street bookmakers up to family bosses. His eventual downfall, and that of his contemporaries, was not the result of a single dramatic raid or a lucky arrest, but of a long accumulation of evidence, new laws like RICO, and the steady erosion of the mafia's central protective device: silence. The testimony of his son crystallized that transformation. In earlier generations, children of mobsters might have inherited not only their father's rackets, but also their commitment to omerta. In the Ruggiano case, the opposite occurred. Faced with long sentences, addiction, and the collapse of the world he had grown up in, Anthony Jr. chose to put words to what his father's generation had tried so hard to keep unwritten. In doing so, he both fulfilled and betrayed his father's legacy, fulfilling it in the sense that he confirmed the depth of Anthony's involvement in organized crime, and betraying it in the sense that he broke the code his father had held sacred. Through that breach, a fuller understanding of Anthony's life emerged. The picture that took shape was not that of a mythic gangster, but of a working criminal manager whose day activities were at once mundane and deeply harmful. He spent long hours not in glamorous settings but in a neighborhood bar, reviewing betting slips, arguing over percentages, and dealing with the endless small conflicts that arise when money, pride, and illegality mix. He worried about cash flow, about whether associates were skimming, about whether someone had talked too freely over a telephone line. At the same time, he made or endorsed decisions that left people dead, businesses ruined, and entire families altered. That mix of the ordinary and the drastic is easy to miss in simplified accounts. Films and television series, even when they aim for realism, must compress time and heighten moments of drama. In that compressed space, a figure like Fat Andy is liable to be remembered only in extremes, as a ruthless enforcer or as a charismatic neighborhood don. The historical record, less constrained by narrative urgency, shows a longer, slower arc. A man shaped by early deprivation, rising within a specific institutional culture, making choices year after year that deepened his investment in that culture and narrowed his exit routes until there were none left that did not involve either cooperation or prison. His death in a prison medical facility at 78 under federal custody was not the ending he or his peers once imagined for themselves. In the early decades of Cosa Nostra, many higher-ranking figures expected either to die of old age at home, largely unmolested by the law, or to meet a violent end at the hands of rivals. The idea of spending one's final years under fluorescent lights, subject to bureaucratic routines and supervised by guards with no stake in the old codes, would have seemed almost alien. Yet that was precisely what happened to Anthony and many of the older captains of his era. They outlived the mafia's most secure period, but did not outlive the legal machinery that finally caught up to them. Their removal from the streets did not, by itself, eliminate organized crime. Even as the traditional Italian-American mafia waned, other forms of criminal organization, some ethnically based, others more diffuse, grew in American cities and beyond. But the decline of figures like Ruggiano did change the texture of certain neighborhoods. In parts of Queens and Brooklyn, the departure of long-trenched crews opened space for different forms of local leadership, community boards, non-profit organizations, immigrant associations, and small business alliances. The process was uneven and sometimes messy. No simple line can be drawn from a captain's conviction to a neighborhood's renewal. Yet over time, the grip of a single crew on a given strip of storefronts loosened. That loosening had cultural as well as economic effects. In communities where the mafia had once been an inescapable topic, if only in careful whispers, young people could grow up with more distance from its myths and demands. For some Italian-American families, this meant a chance to define their identity without constant reference to organized crime. For others, especially those whose relatives had been involved, it created a complicated kind of void. The old stories still circulated at family gatherings, but they now competed with an awareness, fed by news and testimony, of the harm those stories concealed. In that sense, the afterlife of Anthony's reputation became part of a broader conversation about how societies remember figures implicated in systemic wrongdoing. Should he be seen primarily as a cautionary tale, an example of the costs of embracing and tolerating criminal power, as a product of his historical moment, whose path was shaped by forces larger than himself, as a symbol of a particular brand of masculine authority that flourished in mid-century urban America, built on the ability to command both fear and favor? The answers differed depending on who was asked. Law enforcement veterans, former associates, family members, neighborhood residents, or scholars. Those differing perspectives do not cancel one another out. Instead, they underline the layered nature of historical judgment. From the prosecutorial viewpoint, Anthony was a high-value target who for years evaded full accountability, a man whose eventual conviction and death in custody represented a long-overdue victory for the rule of law. From the vantage point of a former associate who did not cooperate, he might be remembered as someone who stood tall and never broke, a standard against which others' choices were measured, however flawed that standard might appear to outsiders. From his son's vantage point, he was both the man who taught him to drive and the man who drew him into a life that nearly destroyed him. A careful historical account has to hold all of those images in view while still making certain basic assessments. It has to note, for instance, that whatever hardships marked his youth, Anthony chose to become and remain a leader in an organization whose business model depended on coercion. It has to acknowledge that, while he may have tried to enforce some limits, eschewing drugs, for example, in line with older mafia rules, those limits did not significantly reduce the damage inflicted on those who fell into the orbit of his loans and bets. It has to resist the temptation, present in some nostalgic narratives, to portray him strictly as a neighborhood benefactor or gentleman gangster whose crimes were somehow victimless. At the same time, such an account benefits from recognizing that the eradication of individual figures like Ruggiano, however necessary from a law enforcement perspective, did not address on its own the deeper issues that make communities vulnerable to organized crime. Economic inequality, mistrust between residents and official institutions, and the allure of alternative power structures that promise swift, if dangerous, remedies to everyday problems. Those conditions, in various forms, still exist in many places. The difference now is that they may give rise to different kinds of underground networks less tied to an ethnic tradition like Cosa Nostra, more fluid and often more directly involved in narcotics. In that shifting landscape, the story of Fat Andy functions as both history and warning. It shows how, over time, a man can become the embodiment of a particular system of unofficial authority, so interwoven with the life of a neighborhood that it is hard for residents to imagine alternatives. It also shows how that authority, no matter how entrenched, can be broken when external institutions are sufficiently focused and internal loyalties sufficiently strained. The code that once seemed unbreakable did, in the end, break not for everyone, but for enough people that the secrets of his era could no longer be fully contained. Today, someone walking down a commercial strip in Ozone Park or Howard Beach might pass the spot where his bar once stood without recognizing it. The awning has likely changed, the interior remodeled, the clientele rotated through waves of demographic change. Yet the historical layers remain, even if invisible to the casual eye. In old city directories and property records, his name appears as an owner or lessor. In police and FBI files, the address shows up again and again as a location of interest. In the memories of those who are old enough, the place is still tied to the image of a stocky man behind a table, listening, deciding, collecting. That gap between the visible present and the buried past is where much of organized crime history lives. It reminds us that the built environment of a city contains stories that are not immediately apparent, that a quiet storefront can once have been the site of decisions that reverberated across families and years. It also underscores the importance of documentation, not to sensationalize or glamorize, but to ensure that what was done in the shadows is not lost entirely to rumor or romanticization. In the end, Anthony "Fat Andy" Ruggiano's life traces a full circle through 20th century American history. He was born into a country that viewed his community with suspicion, came of age in neighborhoods where formal institutions often failed residents, found his place in an organization that promised empowerment on its own terms, and then lived long enough to see that organization systematically targeted and largely dismantled by the state. Along the way, he accumulated wealth, fear, loyalty, and, ultimately, a burden of responsibility for acts that his own son would one day detail under oath. He did not leave behind manifestos or reflective letters. He did not publicly explain or justify himself. What we know of him comes from the fragments of bureaucracy and memory. Arrest records, court filings, surveillance reports, the recollections of those who knew him as boss, colleague, father, or antagonist. From those fragments, a portrait emerges that is at once specific and representative, the story of one man, and the story of an era in which men like him could, for a time, exert a kind of localized sovereignty over parts of America's largest city. That era is receding now, its principal actors dead or aging, its codes eroded, its former strongholds altered beyond recognition. But its traces persist in the lives of those who were hurt, in the legal doctrines forged to confront it, and in the cautionary narratives that continue to unfold in documentaries, classrooms, and living rooms. To follow the life of Anthony Ruggiano from a Brooklyn childhood to a prison infirmary is to follow, in miniature, the rise and partial fall of American Cosa Nostra itself, and to be reminded that history's most enduring lessons often lie not in the grand pronouncements of leaders, but in the accumulated choices of individuals navigating imperfect worlds.